For arranging this, we started pre-COVID trying to arrange a time to have either an in-person or now Zoom presentation with Shelley. So we're absolutely delighted that she's here today. Shelley is a former NPR commentator and the author of numerous books of fiction and history of medicine, and that range from children's books through adult books. She's going to discuss with us today her book, Borrowing Life: How Scientists, Surgeons, and a War Hero Made the First Successful Organ Transplant a Reality. It's one of her works focusing on the history of medicine. Among her other nonfiction historical works is The Polio Hole, a personal and societal story about the impact of polio and polio vaccine in America. Her first novel, The Queen of October, was a New York Times notable book, and her second, Replacing Dad, became a CBS movie. Her third, The Turning Hour, is about a high school senior recovering from a suicide attempt, and it was used in the Alachua County School District as a suicide prevention project and won a governor's award in 2006. Shelley grew up in Arkansas and Tennessee and went to the University of Mississippi. She came to Gainesville with her husband, Dr. John Parker Mickle, when he joined the College of Medicine faculty as a pediatric neurosurgeon in 1979. And she created with her husband a book press that sought out and published stories by and for children living with physical differences. So Shelley, we're really delighted to have you here. Apologize again for the delay in getting it organized, but now you're here, and we're so glad that you would join us today and share some of your stories with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. This is the Lunch Bunch. If you want to go get a sandwich and eat along while I talk, that would be great, and save some for me. So anyway, I want to talk to you about the fact that for many years I was a novelist, and I decided I wanted to try my hand at narrative history. So I wanted to write as my first project something about a project that was just simply about goodness. I didn't want anyone in the story to be driven by money, a desire for fame or power or ego. Well, a little ego. We'll give them a little, a little space on that. But anyway, one morning I was asking my husband for suggestions, and he said, well, that story about Joe doing the first kidney transplant would make a mighty fine story. He trained under Joe Murray at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital in Boston. So when I looked into doing that, I thought, well, surely David McCullough, Walter Isaacson, some of these wonderful writers have already done that. I couldn't find anything that had been written for the general public. There was a lot of written for other doctors. It was like going to great grand rounds, but I decided, this is a story that everyone needs to know. And here's my big confession. I made a C in college zoology. So how was I going to do this? But recently I have seen a lecture with David McCullough talking about when he was bitten with the idea to write about the Brooklyn Bridge. He said he hated engineering and math, ran from it as fast as he could. But the story was so compelling and he was so passionate about it, he learned to conquer those details. And so more or less that's what happened to me. Because when I found out that the first successful kidney transplant on December 23rd, 1954 in Boston, is considered one of the greatest contributions to humankind in the 20th century. So I think everyone should know about it. And it's a perfect story for young graduating seniors in high school or colleges or wherever, because the like of the greatest generation is not going to come back. I mean, they're there, but anyway, it was the fact that these surgeons and scientists during World War II applied all their talents to trying to make an organ transplant work. So I want to talk about how that started. And it started actually with crush syndrome, which was what happened after the London bombings. When they dug people out of the rubble, most often their kidneys had shut down, and that's why it was called crush syndrome. But caretakers found that if they could keep these people alive for 10 to 14 days, most often their kidneys would regenerate and heal and begin working on their own. So they realized if you have a bridge to fit together those two parts, prior injury and after injury or disease, that it would eliminate a lot of suffering. So get this, what I want to talk about during World War II, because that old saying, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. But during World War II, there were ways found to preserve life. And I don't know about you, but this Ukraine war is eating me alive. So I like to talk about something positive that can come from it. So during the London bombings, when they realized they needed a kidney bridge to keep these people alive, in Nazi-occupied Holland, a young physician invented the first dialysis machine out of sausage casings and tomato cans. And he dropped the blueprints off for that amazing engineering invention in 1947 at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital after the war. But that set the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital up as being the center, worldwide center to treat kidney disease. So the next thing that happened that came with all these people around the world, a team developing to create this amazing contribution of organ transplantation. Not many of us today know about Peter Medawar because he's British, but he was so brilliant at Oxford. He could major in anything, but he finally declared himself a zoologist. He was would be considered so brilliant later in life that he is now compared to Galileo in terms of what he discovered about human biology. And today he's considered the father of immunology. But back to when he was young and didn't know who or what he was going to do, he was in his back garden in Oxford when a Spitfire plane from London, a British pilot, crashed in his neighborhood. And all of his neighbors ran to the crash site and helped get the pilot to the hospital. So Peter was really invested in this happening. He went to the hospital the next day to see how the pilot was doing, and the physicians taking care of him begged Peter Medawar to put his brilliant mind to work solving how to get skin grafts to last, because skin grafts from one person to another only last for 2 weeks to 10 days, 10 days to 2 weeks. So Peter later always said, people born with this kind of intellect need a shock to focus their lives and their energy. And he said that was the shock. So he took it on. And fascinatingly enough, you need to read the book to get to know Peter. I won't tell all the secrets, but he was like 6'5" with movie star good looks, had more talent than he knew what to do with. So anyway, he was going to a conference of veterinarians, and he sat down at a table. He was very extroverted with a veterinarian from Northern England who asked him, he said, you know, we need to find out which of our calves that we're breeding are identical twins or fraternal twins. How do we do that? So Peter said, well, you just do a skin graft, because at that time, if babies were mixed up in a nursery, science knew that if identical twins exchanged skin, it would not be rejected. So Peter Medawar said, do that. Exchange skins between the calves, and we will find out which ones are fraternal and which are identical. Well, the guy called him up and said, Peter, we really don't know how to do this. Would you come up and do it? So Peter did. And then he went back, and his second great shock was none of the skin had been rejected. So that was the first realization that when fluids are exchanged in the womb, it made these two biological entities able to exchange foreign matter, foreign skin. So he solved that problem. And as a result, he did many other experiments and had other people, as you know, science works where other scientists were duplicating his experiments to see if they held up. And that one did. So pretty soon, Peter was injecting eggs with cells from another chicken. And so he created these chimeras, animals that could exchange tissue without rejection. And an interesting part I found was that to take care of his mice and his chickens were the Italian prisoners of war during World War II. And he said, well, I don't trust them. So Peter took care of them himself, and he had a great sense of humor. But they said you could always see him running across the Oxford campus carrying a chicken or a mouse or something like that. And it was just great fun for Peter. He had a great sense of humor. In fact, when he published his work, get this, this is just amazing. When he published his work on putting on display how the immune system works, he published it in the same journal of Nature that Watson and Crick published the discovery of DNA. I mean, what a moment in time. And all this happened during World War II. So anyway, now we bring in the other part of this amazing discovery toward organ transplantation. In Boston, Joe Murray was 25 years old with only like 9 months of surgical training. And every medical school in America was drafted after the attack on Pearl Harbor. I found that just chilling and riveting to think about that. Every medical school student in America was drafted after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Joe was sent to a big military hospital in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, with only 9 months of surgical training. And he thought he would be sent overseas. He turned out to be so valuable there that they kept him there. But anyway, one day, this is the other part that comes in, Charles Woods grew up in an orphanage in Alabama during the Depression. And he wanted more than anything to be a pilot. So he finally became one at age 22, joined the Air Force during the beginning of World War II. And he was assigned to deliver 28,000 gallons of aviation fuel over the Himalayan mountains to a Chinese base to help defend against Japan. So he became so good at that he began instructing students doing that. And it was a 24-hour mission. They flew over the Himalayas, came back and started again, and then had a little bit of time off. But it was an amazing mission. So anyway, he was taking off one day with 28,000 gallons of fuel, and his plane crashed, and he was burned over 70% of his body. Ordinarily, with someone burned that horrifically, they live about 10 minutes, but Charles Woods was determined to get back home to his wife and baby, Miriam, and his toddler son. So he fought really hard. It took 6 weeks to fly him back to the Phoenixville hospital where Joe worked, because they had to stop every day and give him baby food, change his bandages, hydrate him. He was in such delicate shape. So anyway, when he landed, and Joe Murray was on the team to take care of him, and he was like minutes from dying. And so the team taking care of him decided to try a Hail Mary. It had never been tried before. But it just happened that day, that morning, a custodian at the hospital, a young man, had died of natural causes. And they said, well, why don't we take some of his skin and try to cover the wounds of Charles Woods to save his life. So very quickly, they found the parents of the young man's life, and they agreed. So they took the skin to graft over Charles Woods's wounds, and a miracle happened. Later, what the miracle was that those skin grafts lasted nearly a month. Ordinarily, they would be sloughed off in like 10 to 14 days. So later, Joe lived with this phenomenon and later figured out it must have been that Charles's immune system was so depleted, depressed, that he accepted the skin from someone who was not even related. But anyway, Charles Woods lived, and Joe built him a face. He had to walk out into the world with a horrible disfigurement. And I'll tell you the end of the story of Charles Woods, or you can read in the epilogue in the book, because it's just absolutely amazing. So after Joe saw how those skin grafts lasted, he asked the question, well, why don't we borrow organs to help save a life? And that was the first light of the curiosity of that. When Joe got back to finish his residency after the war, people said, well, you're crazy to get involved with this. You shouldn't do it. But Joe was so convinced within himself that it was possible and should be done, because the suffering of mainly kidney patients was horrendous, and there were so many of them. So anyway, he dedicated his research to the next 8 years. And the other part that came in was they discovered that dogs were the best means to develop the surgery, because the arteries and veins of a dog are very similar to a human, but they didn't know how to put them together. So another discovery came from Europe with ladies making lace. So they learned to use the stitch of women who were working with lace to put together arteries necessary for a kidney to clean the blood of someone with horrendous kidney failure. So anyway, the next thing that they knew, they brought Medawar to America. He gave lectures at Harvard, and supposedly, this is fun to think about, by then the whole world was gripped with this idea of organ transplantation, and the fact that Medawar had discovered how the immune system works. And so when he gave lectures at Harvard, people stood outside for blocks waiting to get in. He was like the new rock star. And the organ transplantation really caught fire like the moonshot. In the 60s, it was the greatest thing happening. So the other part of this team that I need to talk about a little bit, because you can read so much more about him in the book, is Franny Moore. He was the youngest chief ever of surgery at Harvard, at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital. And he's the one who brought all these parts together. He was like the general, the commander in charge of getting this done. And he believed in organ transplantation. He had gone to Harvard with JFK, John Kennedy, and they were friends. And Franny was so brilliant on his own that he was expected to do great things. But the interesting thing about him, and I knew him, I had met him and was scared of him. But when I read his memoir, you know, I learned things that, oh my gosh, what an extraordinary human being. He was the son of someone who had invented something from the railroads to keep from rippling and causing a rail crash. So he was terribly wealthy. Franny grew up in a mansion on the Lake of Chicago. And when his parents realized that he was a good student, they started their own school based on Eastern schools. So Franny was well educated. But when he decided that he wanted to go to medical school because he loved science. But my point is this: he didn't have to do anything in life. He could have had his inheritance. He could have taken over his father's company and invention and lived comfortably forever after. But he was bitten with science, and he was bitten with alleviating people's suffering. So when he went to medical school at Harvard, the funny thing was he fell in love with his wife when he and she were 15. So he was like one of only 2 medical students who were married. So he went with Laurie to medical school, and he said the funny thing was, it was during the Depression, and they wanted to let anybody in who could pay for it. So he said, I couldn't even brag about getting into Harvard because they were so eager to have me pay tuition. So anyway, he did. And his claim, his shock in life was he was a resident in surgery during the Coconut Grove fire. If anybody knows anything about that, it was one of the biggest disasters to kill civilians. And what was so horrifying about it, it happened during the day after Thanksgiving, when all the soldiers were home on leave for the holiday. So many of the young soldiers who had been drafted for World War II were killed in that fire. But Franny decided from there he would do research on burns. And that's how it really connected with Charles Woods and what they had found there. He was a perfect fit for this mission of transplanting the first kidney. So then the next thing that happened with this team coming together, they had the kidney center all set up and people were desperate to get there for dialysis. So Joe got a call one day from a physician in Western Massachusetts who said, I have a patient here who's dying, needs to be dialyzed. Will you take him? And Joe said, well, I think he's too far over the edge. And then the consulting physician happened to say, but he's got a twin, an identical twin. So immediately Joe sent for him. So Richard Herrick and Ronald Herrick became the first patients to try this transplantation. So the interesting fun parts, because I'm always interested in culture. Joe was so insistent that they be a perfect match. He did, first of all, skin grafts between them, and both the skin grafts took. But as he got closer to the scheduled surgery, he got nervous. So he sent him to the police station to be fingerprinted. And he didn't know, as a lot of us don't know, I didn't, that journalists, reporters hang out at the police station wanting to pick up a story. And when they realized what was happening, the newspaper's headlines the next day was the first organ transplant is going to be attempted on December 23rd here in Boston. So the country kind of went nuts over that. It became a big deal. So this is the next part that's really fun. Joe was born left-handed, and the teachers in school insisted that he become right-handed. So in the operating room as a surgeon, he was ambidextrous, which meant that he could do certain things without walking around the operating table. He could save time of the patient being under anesthesia. He just had he was a wonderful surgeon. So anyway, the night before the surgery, which is scheduled for December 23rd, mainly because Richard Herrick was dying. He couldn't stay on dialysis much longer, if at any. So anyway, they scheduled it for that day. And Franny and Joe decided we need a rehearsal. So they called all the Boston hospitals and said, if you have a cadaver come in tonight, please call us. So Joe was home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, mixing drinks for a Christmas party when the call came. So Franny grabbed the surgical instruments and met them there in the morgue, and they practiced one more time. So the next day when they did the surgery, 5.5 hours, and from that, just to underscore how important this story is, a painter was chosen. A lot of photographs were taken, but years later, Franny found a painter, Joel Babb, who lives in Maine, to paint from those photographs and to come to the operating room and duplicate that surgery on canvas. And it hangs in the Harvard Medical School Library, Countway Library, next to the painting that takes a whole wall of the first time anesthesia was given to a patient. That painting is worldwide famous. Most everyone knows about that painting, but also the surgery that Joe performed that day hangs next to it, and it takes up one whole wall. It's huge. So in the process of all this, I'll get back to my part a little bit in this. My editor said, well, do you have a suggestion for a cover? And most always, an author never gets to choose the cover. But I said, well, there's this painting you should consider. But I think the painter is probably dead. So I don't know that we could get permission to use it. And he said, well, let me know. So I started researching Joel Babb, and I knew he had was from Maine and he displayed his paintings in a gallery there. So I called the gallery and he answered. So I said, Joel, don't take this wrong, but I thought you were dead. So it's kind of been a great friendship that we forged, and that's been our joke between us. But he has this wonderful painting there in the Harvard Medical School Library. So another part of this that I think is just extraordinary, the day after, on Christmas Day, after Joe had done 5.5 hour surgery, the local hospital called him and said, we have a child who's broken his face on his Christmas bicycle. Would you come stitch him up? And Joe did. Joe's favorite saying was that work is a silent prayer. So to me, to have spent time writing this book with extraordinary human beings has been a gift of my lifetime. So I'll open it up for questions, anything else, and then I will tell you about the epilogue. Are there any questions so far? Have I been clear?
No one has written a question yet.
Okay, well, you all think about it, and then I will tell you the only disagreement I had with my editor was I had to decide somehow, being a novelist, and my guide was Shelby Foote, who said when he started writing Civil War history, he'd been a novelist for several years prior to that, and he realized history had a plot. It was just that the characters and the events were not fictional. So he said, when you structure these into a story, publishing a book, it's very similar, and you should go at it like a novelist if you are a novelist. So that was my permission to relax a little bit. But I was wondering, how am I going to land this puppy? So I gave myself permission one day to write the story up to where the Holy Grail was finding a match for a transplant patient that was not related in any way. In other words, to transplant a kidney from a cadaver or a family member who was not a twin, identical twin. That was the Holy Grail. So I told myself, once you get to the Holy Grail, you should quit this story and you don't have to dribble it out anymore. And the point was that by that time, drugs to treat cancer were discovered to deplete the immune system enough to allow a kidney from someone unrelated to be transplanted. And one of the most interesting things about this that I found, it's still very chilling. After the atomic bomb was dropped in World War II, all the research monies from the Atomic Commission and all the worldwide governments wanted to fund medical research to help survivors of nuclear blast. And a lot of the money for Joe's research and Franny's research came through that, because they found out that the survivors of Hiroshima immune systems were so depressed. You know, they often died from that, most often. But anyway, that was their impetus. I just found that chilling. So anyway, when they found these drugs to treat cancer, depress the immune system so deeply, they could then move toward transplanting kidneys that weren't related or not from identical twin. So that's where I ended my book. Then I got into a debate with my editor. He said, "You've written an epilogue, because what happens to all these people I've just told you about is extraordinary. They all lived long lives. Joe lived to 93, I think, and Franny was 88 and committed suicide because he could not deal with the fact that his vessel, which he always called the body, had given out so completely. And Peter Medawar had a devastating stroke in the middle of a speech and continued to give his lectures all around the world for the rest of his life. And Charles Woods, I hate to give this away because I really want you to read the book. Anyway, Charles Woods went back to Alabama with his wife and his child. He eventually had 9 children. You know, all these people after World War II wanted to repopulate the American people. So they all had big families. But Charles Woods, when he got home and he was horribly disfigured, you can find pictures of him on YouTube, because he ran for president. He ran for the governor of Alabama. And when his high school friends told him, you know, you could raise turkeys and sit on the front porch and drink beer with us for the rest of your life. You don't need to do this. And he always said, I didn't work this hard to stay alive, to sit on the porch and drink beer. His story, his personal story, is amazing. He died of cancer in his late 80s, I think, but he lived a long, valuable life. And it's a lesson to all of us, because he said, you know, the worst thing of meeting monsters is to be the monster yourself. And he was. Children ran away from him. Everyone was afraid of him because of how he looked. So you can actually see interviews with him on YouTube when he was running for president. So my point is the epilogue to me was very important. And my editor said, well, I think you've written the longest epilogue in the history of literature. And I said, okay, we'll settle on that. But I insisted on it because I wanted the book to have the feel of a plot of a novel with a crisis and then the denouement of finding the drugs to handle rejection. But to me, it's just a little gem for young people and medical students and the general public. I wanted to reach the general public because it really does teach a lot about how the immune system works, which we've just dealt with the pandemic. And also, it's a short read. My editor believes in people not wanting to read over more than 250 pages today. So we work really hard to keep it down to that. But it was a joy of my lifetime. And then I'll share this with you because it came out during the pandemic and it was hard to get this book to people's attention. However, it landed, I don't know how, with someone in the American Science Association, and they chose it as one of 4 finalists for a book award. So now it is in high school libraries and whatnot in the STEM, for the STEM departments, because they said it was written simply enough for high school students to ingest. I thought it was going to be only an adult book. But, you know, I shared with you the fact that I nearly failed college zoology. So by the time I understood these complicated medical aspects and theories, if I could work hard enough to distill it down to where I could understand it, I thought my reader could. So anyway, I guess I could say I'm kind of proud of that. Did we have one question there coming through?
We have several questions. Judy has a question. I'm very curious about early organ donor approval process. I assume the families were asked, but I'm curious how they responded when it was such a new concept.
Well, what's heartbreaking is most of the patients that came to Joe were so close to death that it was not even a question they considered. That one woman, and Joe kind of had a nervous breakdown over this. It really broke him. She was a mother of 2 children, and she had been born with only 1 kidney, and that happens apparently, not usually, but it's fairly common. So anyway, she was set to have her son or someone give her a kidney, even though they weren't identical twins. And of course, back then you didn't really know how to match organ and recipient, but they depressed her immune system by x-rays in the operating room. And she lived in the operating room for like a month or 6 weeks because she couldn't leave after her immune system was so depleted. And at the last minute, when they felt that they were ready to do the transplant, she died. And that broke Joe. And they had several residents. That happened to many patients, because they came to the Brigham to have their lives saved, and they were willing to do anything. And apparently, you know, you can't stay on dialysis forever, or at least you couldn't then. I don't know what it's like today. I gave myself permission to not have to know everything kidney. So if you want to know about having a transplant today, I'm not your girl. But anyway, that was the course that they followed, and some of the residents accused Joe and his team of being murderers and wanted to quit the residency. But then they started having these amazing successes, and they had 2 or 3 in the late 60s, which is where I end the book, the story, with the success, what they call the Holy Grail. I have one other amazing story to tell you real quick. There were a group of residents that were up at midnight, and they were bold and eager to save people from suffering. And there was a young woman 29 years old, who'd had a botched abortion and had been in a coma for like 10 days. And she was like minutes from death. So these 3 residents decided they were going to take a kidney from a man upstairs, the floor up above, who had just died, and try to save this woman's life. They didn't even have time to get to the operating room. They did it in a treatment room at the end of the hall. They took that borrowed kidney and placed it in this young woman's arm. And after they sutured the veins together, the arteries together, she woke up. You know, her blood was being cleaned. The uremic poisoning had been stopped. Well, the reason that became an urban legend, but they couldn't write it up because they didn't have permission. They were mavericks, you know, they were doing a loop-de-loop in their airplane there. So anyway, I think that's a great story, but it became an urban legend in the fact that that was the first transplant between unrelated human beings. And she lived like many months after, walked out of the hospital. But that was a breakthrough in the research.
When they took the kidneys from the donors, did they get permission from the families though? Like you
Oh
said?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Everybody was on board because they wanted to save that patient that was dying, just, you know, hours, days from dying. So it was such a desperate situation.
Okay, we have another question. It's maybe a few questions from Flo Turcott. Shelley, what a fascinating and inspiring presentation. My college boyfriend is the happy recipient of a kidney transplant.
Wow.
What gave you the idea to tell this amazing story, and how did you transition as a writer from fiction to medical history? P.S. Shelby Foote is my hero.
He's my hero too. He lived in Memphis where I grew up, and I think we share an accent a little bit. But anyway, yeah, I wanted to write narrative history. And when my husband suggested this, and then when I met Joe Murray, he came here as a visiting professor soon after he had been awarded the Nobel Prize. And I met him and talked with him some. And I remember that he told me that one of his sons was a professor at Boston University. So when I decided to write this story, I called Boston University Information and asked for Rick Murray, and he answered the phone. I've been really lucky with people answering the phone that I was looking for. And I asked him if he had the story been told, and he said no. And I said, well, would you give me a chance? And he said, well, I don't know why not. So he didn't know me or whatever, but he was thrilled. And actually, that was one of my greatest thrills. I'll talk about the thrills now a little bit, because that was one. Joe Murray's daughter, who's my age, born in 47, I think. I sent her this before I sent it to my editor, and she sent me an email and she said, you know, I know how this story turned out, but I stayed up all night reading it. So to me, that was my award. And then the other thing that's happened quite wonderfully is I got an email from the grandson of one of either the donor or the recipient. And he said, I never knew my grandfather, but by reading this book, I now know who he was. So that's a sweet result from this effort. Flo, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so glad you know someone with a successful kidney transplant. Isn't it amazing that today we know so many people? It's just become an ordinary treatment. But I think we need to stop and step back and look at this man-made miracle for what it is. You got another question?
I do. Well, I have a comment from Janine Miranak, who says fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
And then a question from Peyton. And Peyton, if I mispronounce your last name, I apologize. Peyton Boggart. What inspired you to write your first book?
My very first novel was The Queen of October. Well, I've always wanted to be a writer, and that has a little bit of a story to it. My grandmother husband died in the flu epidemic of 1918. So she spent a lot of time with us. And it was her job to get me to take a nap. So she would read to me until she fell asleep. And my nickname was the Screaming Mimi. I think I was a lot of trouble. That's the name of a World War II bomb, by the way. So anyway, my grandmother would read to me, and I fell in love with what I called the magic of silent language, reading. When I learned to read myself, I said, oh, I could close the book and go back and open it up, and I could hear the voice of the writer. And I said that this is magic. So my grandmother, I think, really worried that I was going to be the first woman in our family to go to prison. So she started taking me to Sunday school. And there in Sunday school, I heard Bible stories. And I suddenly realized these are older even than my grandmother. So there's something we need in stories, like, you know, air, water. So I dedicated myself then to wanting to be a writer. And then part of that other personal story that's kind of funny, I lived in Memphis, and I went to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, because I knew Faulkner lived next to the campus. So I wrote him a letter, and I told him I was coming, and I hoped to meet him, and I hoped that he would teach me something about how to be a writer, because I had heard he knew one or two things about that. So he had very shortly before won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So anyway, he died like 2 months before I got there. And I took it personally. I thought he'd gone to great lengths to avoid me. So anyway, I've always been dedicated to that. And I think it's a calling. I have a hard time quitting. In fact, from borrowing life, part of my research led me to how many historical figures have suffered from kidney disease, and also characters in novels. It turns out that Charles Dickens wrote about many characters in his novels who suffer from kidney disease. They called it dropsy, the collection of fluid. So anyway, one of those historical figures was the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, Alice, because her mother, when she went into labor with Alice, was diagnosed with Bright's disease, which is kidney disease. And within 2 days, she died. And also on that day, Theodore Roosevelt's mother died of typhoid. So the grief that he suffered was so paramount, he couldn't look Alice in the eye or say her name. And this is part of when he went to the West and became a cowboy, which led to his persona that we know him for today. So anyway, I wrote that story of Alice Roosevelt because she's outrageous. You know, she was 17 when her father became president, and the whole world fell in love with her, like we did with Princess Diana. She was the first Princess Diana. So I thought that would make a great story, especially because she wanted to get back at her father for not loving her the way she thought she needed. So she started carrying in her purse a copy of the Constitution, a dagger, and a green snake named Emily Spinach. And she absolutely captivated the world with her antics. So that book is coming out in October, and it's just been posted on Amazon. So that'll be fun to put the two stories together. It's fun for me. You got another question?
Well, let's see. I have one. Samuel Johnson was one of the famous dropsies of history.
Was he? Yeah.
He was, yes. And I
didn't know
guess,
that. That's fun to
Mhm.
know.
I guess at one point there was a wonderful remission of his dropsy. But there's Flo, thanked you again. And Nico Magnus is regarding the writing process of borrowing life. How did you balance the clinical aspects of organ transplantation with the more intimate personal stories of those involved? In other words, even considering your grade in zoology, how did you decide how much
I love that.
how much medical information you are going to include in your narrative?
Well, there's quite a lot there. And when you read the book, you'll see it. And I think the thing I'm most proud of is I've had several physicians and scientists read it and I didn't make any mistakes. So that's my crown of achievement. But I figured if I could distill it where I understood it, then it would be worthwhile to write it. And also, I think that love stories, relationships make people real. And so I write about the wives, and my editor kept saying, we need more about the wives. He's really big on women's history and not leaving them out. And it's so easy to leave them out when this is a man's story. You know, all these surgeons were men, of course. Harvard admitted their first woman in 1945 into medical school, but it was not like today. And so this is basically a man's story. But I wrote every one of those love stories because they were so important to the men, and the support that the wives gave to all the research they did was extraordinary. And I will tell you this, that of course the animal rights movement made Joe's life hell at times, but he always took care of the dogs exceptionally well, and proved it by having one of them go on a TV program. I've forgotten the name of the dog, but he allowed the dogs to become personal celebrities, canine celebrities. During this era of transplantation was just the talk of everyone. And of course, look at how many lives it saves every day, and how it branched out to liver, heart, lung. And to think of how they perfected that. I mean, Franny had to quit doing liver transplants because so many patients were dying. So it was years before that was perfected. But anyway, I just think it's a very inspiring story, and it's been a highlight of my life to have written it. Other comments?
A comment from Emily McElroy says, thank you for sharing your personal story. I have a question, I guess kind of regarding the polio hole versus this book. I mean, the polio hole is kind of a narrative history of medicine as well. But, and I guess that when you certainly balance the personal with the historical.
Well, actually, that gave me enough confidence to take this on, because I did distill the development of the Salk vaccine, which is very complicated and everyone should know it. But when I decided, since I was in the polio epidemic in 1950 and I was in my late 60s, I thought, you know, I'm living, I hold the living history that's being forgotten. And so I felt a personal obligation to record that, but I knew my personal story was boring and I didn't want to be the center of attention. So I got into all that science of Salk and Sabin, and prior to that. And I guess the big thing about that was that I was able to compress it, because it's a big book. It won the Pulitzer Prize, Polio, An American Story, by David Ducati, something like that. It's been a while, I've forgotten. But he's a history professor in Texas. And it's a big book. And when I read that to understand the science, I thought, oh gosh, I need to make this part of my personal story. So that gave me a lot of confidence to do Borrowing Life.
And I know, as I've known you, you've mentioned different books or types of books that you want to write. Like you said, you always wanted to write a Civil War novel and a medical history narrative. Are there any other types of books that you want to write?
Well, I'm really bitten now with narrative history, because it seems like I have enough of novelist skills to take history and make it like the plot of a novel, like Shelby Foote. So I'm going to do one or two more and then sit by the pool.
And I don't know if you want to divulge this yet or wait until you have the book done, but do you have topics in mind for the one or two more?
Well, I'm working on one now. I don't know that I'll get it published because I'm getting so old. I'm no longer very cool. And to be a writer and promote, you kind of have to be cool. But anyway, I've been bitten with the fact that Benjamin Rush, the first famous physician in America who signed the Declaration of Independence, and Abigail Adams put back together the famous friendship of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, like 12 years before they died. And then I took a poll in the grocery store one day, went around asking people, did you know that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day? And that day was the 50th anniversary of the nation, July 4th. And only 3 people out of 10 knew it. So I'm real worried about my fellow citizens not being able to make good decisions in our politics without knowing all of our revolutionary history. So on a lark, I found out our greatest living historian of the Revolution is a former professor at Brown, Gordon Wood. So I called him up. I called him up and I said, I'm really bitten with this story. I want to find out how that friendship was healed, because I think that's important, relevant today. Is it relevant today, Dr. Gordon Wood? And he said, hell yes, it is. So he wrote me an email to the fact that this could be an important book for, and since I am able to write a book for the general public, adults that will also swing into high school, young adult readers, I think that's where my strength lies. So I hope to be able to do that. I've been researching it for 2 years and I'm ready to start writing. But I'm telling it through the angle now of Abigail Adams.
One of my memories, and I know I can't get it right, so maybe you'll know, is whether it's an anecdote or an actual fact, that on that day when when both of them died, one of them said, at least the other still lives.
Yeah, that was John Adams said about Thomas
Said that
Jefferson.
about Jefferson, at least Jefferson still lives, yeah.
Yeah,
And
but
he was wrong, but you know,
he didn't know that Jefferson had already died, and they didn't tell him.
no.
But they died within 5 hours of each other.
Mm.
But I think it's just, isn't that an amazing story?
Yes.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh. So I think we all should know that. We should all revisit that to understand who we are as Americans and basically what the arguments were all about. I just found out in my research recently that during the 76 Congress, Benjamin Franklin decided he would, as an old man, trounce through the snow up to Canada and ask them to be a 14th colony. So we would look bigger. And guess what they said? No.
No.
But I think that all that is fun to know.
Mhm.
It sort of spreads us out in terms of deepens our understanding of what this nation means on the planet.
Mhm.
And kind of we're at a crossroads now with that war in Ukraine.
Certainly are.
Yes. Well, are there any other questions? Let me just put out a final call because I think we are getting close to the end of our hour.
I want to thank everybody for coming and listening to me
Thank
ramble
you.
on.
I mean, this has just been inspirational and, you know, and entertaining. So
Thank
we're
you, Judy.
so delighted. So when the new book comes out, we're going to invite you back, right?
Oh,
Yes.
I would love to. We've got this Zoom down.
We do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe by then we could even get together in person, but we'll see.
Yeah, thank you.
But
Well,
thank you so very much.
yes, thank you. This has been wonderful.
My pleasure.
All right. And thanks to everyone who was able to attend today.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.